am live. I'm reading The Invisible Way, A Time to Love, A Time to Die by the Reshad Feild. It was published in 1979, and Reshad describes his life in Turkey, and then he came back to England, and he was to meet Noor, who he did meet now, and he went to Stonehenge with Noor, and they stayed in an inn, and this is where they still are. They are to visit John, and I think they have arrived at John's now. When we came down, this is chapter 8, second reading. When we came down to the sitting room some time later, we found no sign of John. So we left a brief note and went out, following one of the sheep tracks down towards the river. The man was still fishing, but it was getting dark now, and the mist was beginning to rise from the water, spreading back from the bank through the long grass in rapidly moving wisps of cloud. Occasionally a bat darted by in the dusk, squeaking shrilly. We sat and watched until the light was totally gone before walking back to the house. John was waiting for us in the hall when we arrived. He had moved his chair by the window to watch us and was just lighting his pipe with a kind of old-fashioned lighter that was designed to strike even in the strongest gale. The effect, however, was a minor bonfire with every suck on the pipe. Clouds of tobacco smoke rose into the air, obscuring John and showering a fine spray of sparks over his clothes. I could not help laughing. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Oh, I see, it's the smoke. I'm sorry about the habit, but smoking is my particular vice. If it really offends you, however, I will do my best not to smoke when you're around, but frankly, I have no reason to give it up at this stage of my life. Fordy gets fed up with me, as I do sometimes forget about the ash, but she puts up with it." We both interrupted him by saying that of course we didn't mind about the smoking. It was just a minor volcano in his pipe bowl that had made us laugh. I was reminded, however, of my surprise when I first went to the Middle East and found that nearly all my teachers and spiritual guides smoked heavily. The long-standing image I had of highly aesthetic spiritual teachers was simply not so. John smiled when I told him this. "You know," he said, "I have an intuition that it is not smoking alone that causes lung cancer, but fear and smoking together. I may be wrong in this, but I do know for certain that fear, coupled with guilt, can most certainly increase the mental chaos from which cancer emanates." "So far as I understand it," he said, "cancer is merely a manifestation of chaos." Having read my thoughts, John paused briefly. "You will probably ask why I got cancer. It's obviously not so simple, is it? Things cannot always be explained logically. Perhaps a serious illness is destiny at work, and nothing can be said about it. Perhaps mistakes we have made in the past are producing an inner sense of guilt that can emerge in the manifested world years later as form of illness. The first thing, however, is not to be frightened. That is how I can live with the cancer I have. Certainly it is painful, but I have worked and worked not to allow myself to be brought down to the state of chaos in which the pain takes over and consciousness is lost. If we lose consciousness, we are asleep and miss the beauty of life. I don't know whether Elizabeth told you," he said, changing the subject, "but I have a very short time to live." Noor and I were shocked to be reminded of it. John seemed so alive, it seemed impossible to imagine his death as imminent. "You too are not to worry," he went on. "Remember why you have come. Life is too precious a gift to waste in limitations or in lack of awareness of all that is being taught and given each moment. I have no fear of death, for I know that there is no such thing. If anything, it has only enabled me to live life even more fully. I have no regrets. It is harder to understand when you are young, but one day everyone has to remember, the earlier the better in many ways. Isn't that right? He smiled. We were silent for a moment. Noor spoke. But how did it start, John? She said, touching his hand. It is a long story, he replied. I don't know all the answers even now, and perhaps it is irrelevant. Suffice to say is that I developed a malignant growth in my left shoulder a little over 8 years ago, and about a year after I became paralyzed. He paused and drew heavily on his pipe. We sat in silence. But perhaps there is a lesson to be learned, he said finally, from hearing the story itself. But first let's have supper, as I'm sure you are still recovering from your drive. He led the way into the dining room. A bottle of claret was already opened and the food was warming on the hot plate. Unlike the first meal we had shared together, John remained mostly in silence. He said that he preferred not to speak at the evening meal if possible, and that he would tell the story afterwards. Over coffee he began. You will have noticed the objects from the Middle East I have in the house, he said. I'm not worried about possessions anymore, but each one of them tells a story. I noticed the objects, rugs, furniture and photographs, and I'm reminded of the lessons that needed to be learned at the time. I consciously remember, so that I do not forget again. It is an art to recollect an experience in past time, knowing that in reality there is no such thing, and to bring the experience into present time in a useful form. The key is relatively simple, and that is that we are continuously being given experiences out of which we can learn. Once understood, we do not need the experience anymore. Perhaps the greatest teacher and lesson of all is life itself. But I am digressing. Just after the war I inherited a little money. The world was split in two then, into those who were trying to pick up the pieces and those who were surging ahead with objective hope. I was one of the latter. I was quite young. During the war I fought in the desert in North Africa, and a friend and I had decided to retrace our steps with the 8th Army. War brings people very closely together, and now, when the promised peace had come, we shared a bond that we felt could never be broken. We had gone through so much together and seen so many of our brothers blown to bits in the desert or trapped in their burning tanks, while we, somehow or other, came out physically unscathed. Emotionally, we were all shot to pieces after those years, as the scars of war take time to heal. But we were some of the lucky ones, and the journey we had decided to take was in some ways a pilgrimage. We had no idea at the onset how radically our well-laid plans would be altered. John lit his pipe again and gazed into the fire. We eventually got used to his silences, but it was somewhat disconcerting at first. Sometimes the silence was only broken when he pushed himself out of the room, leaving us quite alone. He was not eccentric, and he was perfectly mannered, but John was able to go into worlds that interpenetrated the one we normally see. These different worlds are in fact different rates of vibration. The formative worlds of thought, ideas and archetypes that mold much of our thought, action and feeling, we learned not to disturb him. But this time he continued. We started in Tangier. We had decided to buy a good jeep and then to wend our way slowly through Morocco. The country was a smuggler's paradise. It was a centre of trade. There was nothing that you couldn't obtain. I was offered everything from dope and young girls to an unlimited number of second-hand tanks. People made a fortune during that period. They bought up all the war equipment they could salvage for the sake of its metal. It was a strange alchemy, converting base metal in a manner of speaking into gold. Anyway, the first part of the journey went off well. well enough, but matters changed in a small Moroccan village. My friend had been very interested in the world of Islam, and as the war ended he met a man called Yusuf Ali, who had invited him to come and stay with his family in this little village. We did not want to miss the opportunity, so we sent a letter in advance and decided to go for a couple of days. We were warmly greeted, spoiled rotten with food and kindness, so that it became increasingly hard for us to leave. Finally, after 3 days of festivity, we were introduced to an old woman who was very important in the village. And I'm afraid I'll have to stop here because the battery is showing signs of empty. Today is the 14th of April